Welcome back to Off Ball Takes. This is your host, Yarby and this is my co-host.
Wells.
We appreciate all the support on our recent content, and before we do get started, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and follow us on Instagram and TikTok at the OBT Podcast for more content and updates.
Yes. If you're watching this, it is June 2nd, right? That's when this episode is coming out. We're recording it on Sunday evening. And congratulations! We've made it to the NBA Finals. We got one stretch of games left before this season comes to a close. And it's the finals that I think we all expected, right? It's the Indiana Pacers versus the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? So obviously, the last time we had recorded, the Pacers were up 3-2, with the Knicks having just won Game 5 at the time, and the Pacers were able to close it out in Game 6. I know we both picked the Knicks to win the series. I think both of us felt like once the Pacers went up 3-1, series was over. It felt like the Pacers were the better team, especially through the first few games. First off, obviously, shout out to Tyrese Halliburton and Pascal Siakam. Right, Pascal Siakam won the Eastern Conference Finals MVP, right, for his performance in this series, right? So, I mean, obviously, and this was a key guy where we talked about if he has a big series, that might be able to tip things towards the Pacers in their favor, right? We know he's really good, but obviously what he's been able to do as a Pacer, right, has been huge, right? A veteran guy, been in a lot of big playoff games, got a lot of skill on both ends of the floor. If you look at his stats over the course of the series, right, basically, I guess, per game, right, they're really good. They're awesome, actually. I mean, like, essentially, if you look at his stats, he gave you 25, 5, and 3.5, over 50 from the field, 50 from 3. Just fantastic. Tyrese Halliburton, pretty good series as well. 21 points, 10.5 assists, 2.5 steals, playing good defense at different points, 6 rebounds, and shooting 46 from the field. So the key thing with the Pacers, where I think we probably made the mistake, is Pacers more depth, and their style of play was able to best how the Knicks were able to play. When the Pacers were able to run up and down the floor and score in transition or score off a made basket, it just overwhelmed the Knicks over the course of this series. And they had a lot of different guys they could turn to, a ton of depth. We saw in this Game 6, Thomas Bryant steps in as the backup center. Miles Turner is in foul trouble, and Tony Bradley, I think, was listed as active, but he didn't play. I think he hurt his hip in the previous game. He steps in. It's the Thomas Bryant game, like how we talked about the Buddy Hield game earlier in the postseason. And even defensively, the Pacers showed up in this game. I mean, they held the Knicks. It was 108, but some of that was when the game was already over. And Andrew Nembhard, who wasn't able to guard Brunson for most of the series and last year's playoffs, he was the main guy. Nesmith clearly was still a little banged up. Also just didn't do a great job. So you give credit to the Pacers on both ends of the floor. Like I said, the depth, the offense, the transition, the execution, it was all pretty much flawless, right? And that's kind of how you give credit to the Pacers for this series. They were better. For the Knicks, yeah, game 1 was horrible, right? But, I don't really like the phrasing of they lost the series because of game 1, because we also saw Oklahoma City lose a disastrous game 1, and they were able to, against the Nuggets, they were able to close it out anyways, even though it went 7. But either way, we'll start, like I said, from the Pacers' perspective, and just look at the fact that, what did you think overall of this series? Because we both picked the Knicks to win in 7. It was not in 7. They lost in 6. So what do you think that you saw from this series in more detail than in terms of like what the Pacers did, what you liked, and maybe how they were able to slow down the Knicks?
I loved, everything that they did in terms of their rotations. I think, Tibbs definitely got out-coached, I think, in this one, with Carlisle. Granted, there is a personnel thing that, the Knicks kind of have going on where, they can't really reach too deep into their bench. But at the same time, I think the Knicks could have potentially done that in the regular season, maybe to get, those guys acclimated to playing, because a lot of them didn't even play, in some of the regular season games or regular season matchups and or, the previous 2 rounds, right? It's kind of hard to just throw guys into the fire like that. Whereas Indiana, they have a constant rotation. Normally they play, 10, 11 guys, and pretty much all of them really did play in the playoffs, whether you liked it or not. Like there were times when, I didn't want Thomas Bryant out there, like if I was a Pacers fan, right? But, lo and behold, he still, did some positive things on the court, right? And I think that's kind of a testament to how deep they are, right? And I think underrated would be kind of the adjective that you'd have to use to describe this team, right? Super below the
Right.
radar all season. Obviously when we talked about them throughout the season, we thought that they were going to be like one of those dark horses, I guess, in the Eastern Conference, right? Because we knew they had been there last year. They had only gotten better. They had a horrible, slow start, to the season. But ever
Mhm.
since then, like they had pretty much been on par with Oklahoma City, which is kind of wild. I think, there's a stat where it's like the only two teams to win 50 plus games in a certain span was like Indiana and Oklahoma City. So that kind of just tells you
Right.
how well things were clicking for Indiana for majority of the season. But, for this series, in terms of the Knicks, it was the kryptonite, right? It was the depth. They really just couldn't match up in terms of that. Siakam being a true number two, I think that helped, right? Because he's able to really give you anything you want, right? Defensively, if you want to ask him, to be a guy that can, guard up, he can do that, right? But offensively, he can also give you a bucket as well and carry the weight when, a guy like say Tyrese Halliburton is not really, being aggressive as he normally should be, right? Because we already know when he's not as aggressive, the team probably doesn't look as good. But I think having a guy like Siakam out there is definitely a big safety net. Neesmith, they just have so many role players that are amazing and they know exactly what to do and when to do it. Granted, in this game, in this game he didn't really play that much. I think he's been hurt actually, so prayers on that, and hopefully they're definitely going to need him for Oklahoma City. But Neesmith was insane. Nemhard, I think defensively what they were able to do as well. There are times where Jalen Brunson and Karl Anthony Towns actually looked unplayable at certain points. And I think that's kind of wild when you really do think about it because those are your superstars, right? On both ends of the floor, too. Like, you can attack those guys defensively. Whereas, like you said, Indiana, Tyrese Halliburton wasn't really that much of a liability. I think that was something that I think people were kind of hoping for if you pick the Knicks, where you could kind of pick on Halliburton maybe in the same way that you do Brunson, but I think he stood his ground a lot better than Brunson, and that was kind of an underrated aspect I think of the series for sure. But overall, I've been thoroughly impressed with what Indiana's been able to do, right? And coming off of last year, they've only built on that and created more momentum for themselves. So I think they're the severe underdogs in this matchup, but they have been pretty much for every single playoff matchup that they've had thus far. But yeah, you just have to shout out the team as a unit. They've got the chemistry. They've got a great freaking supercomputer that can compute things at lightning speeds, mid game and make amazing adjustments. You have the number two. You have a defensive big man like Miles Turner. You have two defensive guys like Neesmith and Nemhard who can also give you some offense. So the recipe for success is there. But then the bench, I think, is what really puts them over the hump, right? Benedict Mathurin, Obi Toppin, Jerace Walker, like guys like that, they're going to show up. They're going to give you some quality minutes. And I think that's kind of what the Knicks were missing a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, overall, just the fact that they were able to play so many guys, and then like you mentioned, how some guys were key guys early on in the series, and then they weren't as the series went on, or vice versa. Like Nemhard was bad the last couple of games before this one offensively. I mean, they weren't really using him on Brunson. And then
Right.
like say Thomas Bryant, he was the backup center in the postseason by and large. And then he's not very good through the first few games, right? So then they bust out Tony Bradley, and then he gets hurt, so he can't even really play. And then they bring him back, and then he plays Jarris Walker.
Right.
It's another guy, right, where he wasn't playing in this series at all. We saw him like for spot moments, I think, in the earlier rounds and some stretches during the regular season. But then he comes out on looks like he was on crutches after the game. So we'll see what his status is the next round. But either way, other key guys, right? Like Ben Shepherd, right? That's another guy who had a couple of games where he just would come off the bench and play his role. So they have a lot of different guys that can do that. Matherin had 4 points, was a minus 12 in this game, but he had 20 plus points in the previous two games, and one of those was a win. That was a game four, I believe. So a lot of different contributions. Do you think Siakam should have won the award? Because I know like last year, I think Jaylen Brown won it, and I think we both thought it was going to be Tatum, and it wasn't. But what do you think of this one?
Um, I'm fine with it. I think his play, throughout the postseason was phenomenal, right? I think it was a little bit more consistent than Halliburton's, right? Because there were games where Halliburton kind of disappeared off of the face of the earth, and we had talked about that in the last episode, right? And people really, really did crucify him. But I think with Siakam, he steadily kind of gave you everything you would want. I think outside of, I think it was actually I think it was game one, right?
Game one was the one where he was kind of quiet, but they
Yeah,
didn't really need him. They ended
e-
up still winning.
exactly. So, that's the one where I think that maybe has a question mark on it. But at the same time, I feel like he's been, Mr. Consistent. He's been, the most reliable number two that you could possibly ask for. And at the end of the day, the number two's job is literally to pick up the slack of the number one and or complement it at the same time, right? So that's kind of my thing. And I think it's 100% justified. The numbers speak for themselves in all reality. So,
Yeah, the vote was super close. I think it was literally a difference of one vote.
yeah.
So that means that people were pretty split. Like, you could give it to either one. Like, I probably would have picked Halliburton, but like
Hmm.
either way, like both guys were great. Cause like say like Halliburton game one, awesome,
Hmm.
right? And then game four, awesome.
Hmm.
And then I guess this game six, he closed the game. He wasn't there in the early stretch,
Hmm.
but he did ultimately close it and put him out of reach. Because the Knicks were closing in on this game, which happened a lot during this series, right? Like it was a 6 game series. I think I saw a tweet from Zach Lowe, right, that said that like the Knicks literally like their margin of victory, I want to say, or like the margin in terms of the points they scored was literally even. Yeah, like or over the course of their entire postseason. All right, so they had a really competitive bunch of games, and that's kind of like a key thing that we saw over the course of the playoffs for the Knicks, right? Is that like a lot of their games they had to come from behind, overcome deficits, and then be able to close it out and then win it, in a back and forth offensive game. But they were not able to do that against this Pacers team, and the Pacers were able to use some of their strengths against them, right? And that's kind of where you look at the Knicks series, and it's like, yeah, by and large, Brunson and Towns were both offensively pretty good in most of these games,
Hmm.
right? Like you don't really look at them as like be having a horrific series, right? The way that you might have seen from other players at different points, right, in the postseason, right? Like
Hmm.
we've seen that before
Hmm.
from other guys. Like say in this round, Brunson gave you 30 and then 6 assists a game.
Right.
Didn't shoot it as well from three, but by and large, like that's a good offensive series, right? And then Towns gave you 25 and 12, right? You 50 from the field, 37 from three. So I don't know. It's tough. Like the Pacers were better and they pushed them in ways where the Knicks defensively couldn't get a ton of stops. If I sound weird, it's because I'm sick. So sorry about that. But they couldn't really get stops. And then even offensively, right? Like there were some stretches where you're kind of watching them and you're like, I don't know. It looks a little bit different than what you'd expect because, like, even the Brunson Towns pick and roll, we didn't see that as much, right? As you're going deeper into the postseason, right? It's a little bit more one on one, kind of just like basic offense, right? And
Hmm.
then obviously the adjustments to the lineup where now Josh Hart's a bench guy and like they're bringing in like DeLon Wright, Shamit, and others, right? Just felt kind of weird, right? In terms of once they were doing that, not that you can't make adjustments because like OKC, all these other teams have done that at different points. It just felt like we went back to what we saw from the Knicks when they were struggling earlier in the season, where you're kind of like, I'm not sure if I really know what this team really is. Because it's like offensively, they look really good, but then there's stretches where it's kind of lacking. And then defensively, they should be better, but then it's like they're still kind of struggling to get stops. And maybe some of that could just be your two best players are not great defensively. So you have to put guys around them defensively that works. But that's what this is supposed to be, right? Because like it's not like OG Anunoby is a slouch on defense. He's an awesome defender.
Hmm.
Um, Bridges, right, when he's locked in, he's a good defender, right? Hart was kind of disappointing in this series, right? And that's another guy you look at where like so much of it's tied to the jumper. If the jumper's not falling, it's too easy to kind of slow down their offense because then what do? Like we've seen with other guys, they just put the center on him and just dare him to shoot. If he doesn't shoot, playing right into their hands like he did at stretches of this game, right? Because it was kind of close in the third. And then I think it was like he had some possessions where it was like maybe a floater, maybe a pass, maybe a shot, and he made the wrong decision every time. And it just was like a complete just cascading effect where everything was just not going their way. And it's brutal because again, 6 game series, couple of games were literally down to the wire. You could have won this series potentially, but you didn't because the Pacers ultimately were better, right? at most facets of the game. They forced turnovers. They didn't get completely crushed on the boards. They got offensively what you needed to get from most of your key guys. You got the bench playing well. They ran out in transition and didn't allow the Knicks to make it a half court game. So you did everything you needed to do if you're the Pacers. It's just tough because if you're the Knicks, it felt like you left some stuff on the table.
Big time.
It's not the first time we've seen that in the playoff
Mm-hmm.
series, though. So the
Right.
main question for them is, where do you go from here? Because obviously, like, you just lost in the conference finals in a series where they were the favorites.
Mm-hmm.
Most people kind of thought they would win this series.
Mm-hmm.
But you factor in it's still the most successful season they've had in like 25 years, because it was an Athletic article that came out that was kind of like one of those classic, we're going to dump everything once this team gets eliminated so you can see what went wrong. A lot of player only meetings, lots of frustration about certain guys and their roles on the team on both ends of the floor. So that's not really what you want to see. But I can't really call it a failure because of the fact that, like, they pushed a bunch of chips forward to try to go all in. I don't think that was a mistake, right? You could argue maybe they gave up a lot or too much. But these guys, Bridges and Towns, are very good. And they were a part of the most successful Knicks team that we had in 25 years. So I wouldn't really say it's a failure. I know there's been a lot of talk about maybe you fire Tibbs, maybe you trade Towns and go after someone else. But I don't see the point in firing Tibbs because I just feel like the grass, we've already seen it. The grass isn't always greener when you get a new coach. We've seen that with many teams. Ask Phoenix how that went,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or even the Bucks how that went. And then from the Towns perspective, like, he's very good, right? Like, regardless of whether or not you're a fan, he's a very good basketball player. That can be very frustrating. Sometimes that puts a ceiling on how good your team can realistically be. But at the same time, again, you look at the Eastern Conference, right? What team is going to be significantly better than these two teams next season, right? Because, like, the Celtics are going to be kind of in a weird state of flux. Could be a gap year, right? Because you're not going to have Tatum for most, if not all of it. The Cavs still be hanging around. We know they're very good. Maybe they'll be a little bit healthier, but people aren't going to trust them. And, like, in the playoffs, that's probably a more beatable team than what we saw um, in the regular season, right? Because in the regular season, they looked not unstoppable, but they were very good, right? Like, they were right there with Boston and Oklahoma City record wise,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I would probably say just run it back, maybe swap a couple pieces, right? But obviously it's going to get harder because then you're going to have to extend guys like Towns and Bridges. Team will get more expensive. You'll have less flexibility. But unless, like, Giannis is knocking on the door, like, who else are you really like, let's go all in for? Because let's say it's Durant. Does that make a lot of sense?
No.
Like, probably not at this point, especially given what you're probably going to have to give up.
Mm-hmm.
So I would just say, you had a really good season. It's tough because when you took out the Celtics, you thought, all right, here's our chance. Because most people thought Boston would run over them. Obviously, they had issues of their own. But you're thinking, all right, we took care of the Celtics. We don't even have to face Cleveland. We're going against the Pacers. And it's like, nope, the Pacers were better than you. And they beat them last year, although the Knicks were banged up last year. Now they're healthier with a better team. Still didn't work out. So it could just be a bad matchup for them. But either way, I'd still feel like good season overall. Still some kinks you're going to have to work out. Can you realistically win the title? I don't know. That might be a tall task. But clearly, you're still going to be a very good team. And again, if you're in the East, what's the alternative? Just blowing it up and being not very good, but then you'll still potentially be a playoff team, right? With the way that the bottom of the East is. So, that's how I feel about that. And it's like, you lost to the better team. Get back at it. Maybe you might be able to get lucky. Maybe you don't play the Pacers next year
Yeah.
in the playoffs or something like that. Or maybe you might beat them next year. Who knows? So that's how I would look at it. I don't really look at it as this monumental failure, even though, yeah, in the moment, it's a disappointment because you felt like this might be our chance. And you never want to feel like you wasted a potential opportunity because without, like I said, without the Celtics and the Cavs in your way, you thought maybe you could get there, but you couldn't. And I don't know if they would have gotten through Oklahoma City either. So that's the tough part too.
Yeah. I kind of, I pretty much agree with you, right? I don't think they should do anything drastic, right? I don't think there's any need to trade any of the core guys. I mean, maybe you could maybe shop Josh Hart, just maybe, but I still
Right.
wouldn't do that. I would kind of keep everybody because I think, the regular season, it was up and down. Sure, you didn't really beat a lot of teams that were super, duper competitive and teams that were better than you in the regular season. But look, what the payoff was, right? You saw how good this team truly can be once, the playoffs do come around. It's just like you said, when you're going up against a guy like Halliburton, it's kind of hard because he's a tough cover. Not only because of what he does for himself, but what he does for, his teammates, right? It opens up a whole different, I think, level of playing when you're talking about, real ball here, right? But I think the Knicks they'll be okay. They just need to figure out, their finances, right? Because I think the Jalen Brunson contract is pretty cool because it does give them a little bit of flexibility, right? We already know Mikal Bridges is probably going to be, re-signed to a or extension or whatever. But yeah, I would kind of prioritize, I guess, potential depth pieces, right? And I think that was kind of the idea of, the guys that they did draft, right? Like Tyler Kolek,
Right.
Pacome Dadier or whatever. It's like I think those guys were probably drafted to be those, depth pieces that you could really turn to maybe. But I think they need to develop those guys and maybe look for some upgrades on the margin. But I definitely wouldn't touch the core at all. I think Mitchell Robinson, that's an interesting one, because do you trade that, and maybe get something back in return? I don't
Huge
know.
the impact of the series, though.
I agree. I agree. Like, and
Yeah.
that's the thing. Like, do you value what his contract is, or do you value his impact? Right. I think those are kinds of the things that the New York Knicks front office are going to have to weigh. But like I said, I would realistically run it back and really just somewhat focus on gaining a little bit of depth, but don't touch the core.
Yeah, and that's the thing offensively where you feel like, this was supposed to be an offensive team, but it felt like in the playoffs we didn't get the offense that I think we were hoping for with any level of consistency. And that's probably where you get some of the complaints, like I said in that athletic article from. So we'll see what they do. I mean, it's funny because, up until this last transaction cycle, right? Like they hadn't really done like a lot of huge moves, but then it's like, boom, they trade for OG Anunoby. I think when we recorded, what was that, like December of 2023,
Mm-hmm.
and then they trade for Bridges in that summer, right after the season is over last summer, and then right before training camp or the season or whatever, then they trade for Towns. So they do like these three big moves, just like that. So more time, obviously, I guess, to kind of spend fixing some stuff. So, like, that's my point. Like, as long as they continue to add a couple pieces here and there, maybe you get a four, right? Not like somebody that has to start, but just somebody that doesn't feel like it's a small ball wing playing the four, right? Like, because that's what most of these guys felt like. They don't feel like natural fours.
Sure.
That way, you have somebody who can maybe help protect the rim, move their feet a little bit better than say like a Towns, but they're not quite as big as Robinson,
Right.
right? So that way you get a little bit more flexibility there. Can you get that in free agency? Probably not. Can you
No.
get that through a trade? I don't know. Maybe. I mean,
You'd
it
have to give
depends
up
on
Hart.
right. So, and I don't know how much they are willing to do that because before this series, the last few games, he was their starter.
Yeah.
So I don't know
He's gonna stay.
how willing they're going to be to do that.
He's
So
staying.
that's my yeah, so that's my guess. I doubt that they make a drastic move. Like I said, unless you have a scenario where, like I said, Giannis knocks on the door and he's like, I want to go here,
Right.
right? Other than that, I don't think there's anybody else where I'm like, yeah, we're going to move heaven and earth to go get that guy.
Yeah. I
Realistically,
agree
right?
with you. Yeah.
So that's what I would say.
Yeah.
And like I said, it's tough because I know in the closeout game, nobody really played that great,
Mm-hmm.
and that's kind of what you don't really want to see in an elimination game. But it is what it is. Ultimately, like I said, the Pacers proved that they were better, and game one was not a great sign going forward. But again, where they kind of lost the game was, like I said, game two, you didn't respond and you weren't able to close the deal in that one. And that was a problem that the Knicks had against this specific team because they didn't have that issue in the first two rounds, right?
Mm-hmm.
But the Pacers proved to be too much for them on both ends of the floor. that's where you give them a lot of credit.
Yeah, I agree.
So now, moving on, NBA Finals matchup. Indiana Pacers going against the Oklahoma City Thunder, right? Game 1 is going to be Thursday in Oklahoma City. Obviously, they have home court because they are 68, or they were 68 and 14
Mm-hmm.
in the regular season. And what are they, if you combine their playoff record? They're like 80 and 18,
Yep.
something crazy like that, right? So, because
Mm-hmm.
I think they're 12 and 4 in the playoffs. So, obviously, Oklahoma City is going to be a pretty significant favorite in this one. Don't really want to take away anything from the regular season. Oklahoma City won both matchups, but as we've seen in the playoffs, clearly doesn't matter a whole lot. Sometimes guys are in and out. Sometimes teams don't show up. Could be a back-to-back. Could be 4 games in 5 nights. You have to go back and sometimes kind of dig deep into that. You just never know. But either way, it's going to be a game of 2 different contrasting styles, right? Because obviously, like both teams do like to play fast, but Indiana's an offensive-minded team, right? OKC's a defense-first team, and that's where I'm going to be curious to see how this works because that hasn't really been who Indiana's played against in these series, like in the postseason, right? Because I guess the Bucks in the regular season were better on defense than offense, but you also didn't have Lillard for most of it. And you knew in the playoffs, the defense was probably going to look worse. Cavs were really good on both ends of the floor in the regular season, but they were better offensively, just like the Knicks, right? Well, the Knicks were not great defensively for most of the year. They got better as it went on, and I think they finished right about league average. So this time, you're going against the number 1 defense, and it's a historic defense, and you're going against a team that's got the MVP, also the conference finals MVP in SGA. So what does Indiana do on defense to slow him down? I don't know if they can do a whole lot, right? Because, you look at some of the other teams that he played against. Minnesota's a really good defensive team. Didn't have much of an answer for him. Denver was not in the regular season, but they looked better in the playoffs. They played zone. And that kind of stifled him in a few games, for sure, right? But ultimately, it wasn't enough. And they were able to force turnovers, too. Then you don't really look at the Memphis series because everyone knew they were winning that one pretty decisively. So the Pacers' path obviously has been a little bit trickier because aside from the first round, they were playing all the other ones on the road, right? So they've done a really good job at kind of playing above what you've probably thought. Now, funny enough, since January 1st, they are 41 and 13 since that point, right? With Tyrese Halliburton out there, right? Because I think there were some games maybe where he was in and out,
Mm-hmm.
whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Either way, that means they've been an elite team for the last 5 months.
Right.
So, like you said, that's the point that you made where record wise, they've been just as good as some of the other best teams in the league for the latter part of the season.
Mm-hmm.
It's not how you start, it's how you finish.
Yes,
But
sir.
OKC's been great all year, and they've been really awesome in the playoffs, right? And they're just coming off a 5-game series where their young guys outside of SGA really had a huge series, right? Because like Jalen Williams wasn't great in the Denver series, although he was awesome in Game 7. He was great in the Minnesota series. So that's going to be the continued question for OKC is what do the non-SGA guys do on offense? Can they continue to keep up their contributions that we saw? Felt like there may have been a leveling up in the last round. If that holds, that's how you get a quick series. Can they force Indiana to turn over the basketball? Because Indiana doesn't really turn the ball over a ton. They had a few games against the Knicks where they did, but they normally take very good care of it. And that's kind of where you look, where you're like, well, if the Knicks can force some turnovers, imagine what Oklahoma City can do.
Mm-hmm.
That's where I think Oklahoma City's going to win this series. I have it a little bit more competitive where I'm kind of going back and forth between 5 and 6. I settled on 6 because I thought there were probably a couple of games where Indiana just plays out of their mind offensively. But at the same time, I don't know. I think it's going to be tough for the Pacers to win this one because we've seen this before where we go into a finals and we're like, oh, this is going to be a great series, right? Where we got, 2 really good teams. They got a lot of talent. Look at last year, right? Like we both thought that series was going 6. It was in 5. And the Celtics went up 3-0. So wasn't really that great. Funny, this is what the third straight finals matchup where you got two guys competing for like their first chance at a ring,
Mm-hmm.
right? Or I guess two guys competing who haven't won a championship, right? Because I think the first year we did it, right, it was Heat Nuggets. Those guys both hadn't had a title. Then it was Mavs Celtics, same thing.
Yep.
Now it's Pacers Thunder.
Yep.
So, like I said, I think it'll be a fun matchup. Can Indiana run and get out in transition after main baskets? Can OKC's offense level up? Because again, we know Indiana defensively, it's a different team than some of the previous teams they played against. They have guys that can ball pressure and be super aggressive. That's where some of it will come down to the whistle. But at the same time, OKC has a lot of that and then some, right? Like you got a bunch of physical guys like Lou Dort, like Alex Caruso, which we've seen throughout the entire playoffs. They have depth as well. It doesn't look the same, right? But we've seen them be able to kind of put guys in series, take them out, replace them with other guys. And obviously they got the two big look, kind of like the Knicks, right? Just a little bit different, right? Because they're better defensively as a group, right? So that's what I'm very curious to see. Like I said, I would expect SGA to have a big series regardless. Um, for the Pacers to win, you're probably going to need more offensively from Halliburton as a scorer, right? He's probably going to have to be somewhere in that Siakam 25 a game range, in addition to the other playmaking and everything else, right? When the Pacers score 114 or more, they don't normally lose. So can you put pressure on OKC's defense and find ways to score and maybe get some easy baskets, right? Maybe could you make it so that they're too aggressive defensively, and maybe that could be a problem for them. But I think it's going to be not necessarily all for naught, but I think OKC will be able to find ways to slow Indiana down on offense and then turn their defense into offense. So I'm going to give them 6. But I could definitely see this being a beatdown because the last couple of finals ended up being, they had some games where they were competitive, but they were still very short series, right? That's kind of the vibe that we've been getting. And by and large, best team usually probably wins the finals, right? Like we've seen the team with the higher record home court just gone their way pretty consistently. And this is the second time now we've got two 60+ win teams in the finals that were super dominant over the course of the regular season. And I think they showcased that in this series.
Yeah. I've got OKC in 5. Very similar reasons that you said, right? I just think, at home, they're freaking 8-1 in the postseason. Wild. So they've only lost one home game. And they've also won all 8 of those games by pretty much 30 plus. So,
Right.
We already know, I think, what's going to happen. I think they start out 2-0, and from there, it wouldn't even surprise me if there's a sweep. Like that I think could be in the cards here, right? That's how good this Oklahoma City Thunder team is. I'm going to predict like SGA probably averages 30. I think that's definitely going to be in the cards, right? And I don't think that's going to stop here because Indiana's good defensively, but I just think this Thunder team is a whole different animal, especially when, the Robin on this team has it going, and that's J-Dub, right? Because I think he's going to be the key to success too, because he takes so much pressure off of everybody else offensively while also carrying the load on freaking defense, right? And he's going to be, the Swiss Army knife, but also the huge X factor being that second option on the offensive end of the floor while also holding his own against Siakam. Now, I think the interesting thing is it wouldn't surprise me if we don't see as much of the double big lineup just because of the pace that Indiana does play, right? And I think, having a guy like Siakam instead of, a more traditional, I guess, power forward, right? I think that's the key there because, he's going to force, maybe Chet and or Hartenstein off the floor, right? Because there's no way that both those guys are going to be able to keep up. And you'd have to put one of them on him realistically, right? So, I'm curious what that matchup is going to look like. But regardless, that's kind of, I feel like the only thing that Indiana has going for them really is Siakam and what he kind of brings to the table, whereas he can kind of push Oklahoma City to play, I guess, smaller. But the problem is Oklahoma City's just as good when they do play small, especially on the defensive end. You have so many pests. You have Caruso. Wouldn't surprise me if Caruso becomes the Siakam stopper as well, right? So, there's so many factors, I think, going against Indiana where, like I said, a sweep wouldn't surprise me at all, but I'm being generous giving them, 5 games. Great team, Indiana, great story for sure. One of the most fun teams to watch. It's amazing, when they're hot, they're amazing, but I just don't expect them to be able to step up to the plate on this matchup.
Yeah, exactly. I think that's kind of where the case for a non-competitive series is. OKC forces Indiana to turn the ball over, and then from there on out, that's where it's pretty much game over.
Yeah.
So Indiana has to take care of the ball. That's the number one thing they got to be able to do. And then pretty much after that, 3-point shooting, they've been the number one 3-point shooting team in the playoffs. OKC was not very good from three for most of the postseason. They were much better against Minnesota, 37% on the series. Before that, they were like in the low 30s.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something where Indiana defensively, that's probably something they're going to explore. Continue to kind of bank on. We're going to give some shots to some of those guys because we don't believe that they can hit them at a good enough rate. Like Lou Dort, you're wide open. We don't care. And then name whoever else you want, right?
Right.
We've seen that the entire postseason for Oklahoma City, and it hasn't mattered. So that's kind of the big thing. They haven't needed to knock down threes like they did in the regular season in order to win games. So that's my concern for the Pacers is if their offense is contained at least even a little bit, I think it's going to be tough for them to hold on. Like if it's a super low scoring affair, you would think that would probably, benefit Oklahoma City, right? But I guess you could also make the case like if it comes down to one last shot, could Indiana do a better job than Oklahoma City in terms of generating some good looks? You could make the case for that as well.
Yeah.
But we've seen Indiana usually when they win all season, it's when they're scoring a ton of points. Like I mentioned, when they hit 114, that's basically their, that's their benchmark. When they get that, they don't lose.
Yeah.
So if it's like 94, 98 with 2 minutes to go, or then that probably is not a good game for Indiana, right? Because we saw that kind of against the Knicks.
Right.
So that's where I do worry for them. Turner, can he be better in this series than he was against the Knicks? Right? Like, I mean, over the course of this series, 13-3 did give him 2 blocks a game. Obviously, rebounding wise, through the first few games, he was on Town. So it's kind of hard to also grab rebounds and then contest with Towns when he's firing from 3, but also driving downhill.
Mm-hmm.
And then if he misses and plays defense, somebody else probably has to get the rebound usually. So, that's the tough part there. But I don't know. I would expect a better series probably from him, but I don't know. I think it's going to be tough. But at the same time, yeah, you could also make the case OKC doesn't have as many crazy offensive players to kind of have to deal with. So maybe that's where Indiana might benefit a little bit, but I don't know. Like I said, I think I would be surprised if Oklahoma City lost this series, personally.
Yeah, I think that would probably be one of the biggest upsets, I feel like, in NBA Finals history, right? Because I know people are gonna hate this statement, but I feel like this Oklahoma City is an all-time team, right? Already, and they haven't even won the title yet. I think what they've been able to do on both ends of the floor is historic, and you can't argue that. The stats are there, the proof is in the pudding. So it's just on people to accept that. And if a team like that loses to underdog, like I said, it really would feel like like the Dallas Mavericks winning the title against the Miami Heat, right? Like, and that's what I talked about, where it's like, I think I mentioned that a while back before Indiana even like was up in that series. Like that's how magical of a run they really have been on. It's really been fascinating to see, but I just don't think they have it in them. I don't know. We'll see though.
Yeah, and who was the coach of that Dallas team? It was the
right.
coach of the Pacers, Carlisle.
Yeah, man.
We hadn't even mentioned, in this podcast once, but obviously shout out to him for kind of being the ringleader of a lot of the decisions that Indiana has made in this series. And it's funny because this was a guy where last year, right, I think us and others kind of thought there were some questionable decisions made in the conference finals, right, against Boston, right, in a couple of those games. You don't say that like they just lost the series because of the coach. They got swept. Right? You don't usually get swept just because of the coach.
Yeah.
But there were some decisions at the end of games that I think we felt were a little bit questionable. But it's also like the guy is a champion, and now he's coached 2 teams that got to the finals. And like you said, the Dallas one was pretty improbable. And then this one, getting to the finals in and of itself was improbable. Conference finals was kind of considered improbable for some. And then now, obviously, they're at the finals, 4 wins away. Doesn't feel like a lot. but I think it is going to be a lot against this Oklahoma City team. So, like I said, maybe being 6-6 is too kind to Indiana, but I don't know. I think there could be a couple of games there, but also like if OKC is the team that we all believe in, then it shouldn't be surprising or shocking if they ended up just massacring this team, but then it ends up being a quicker series, right? Because
Exactly.
like that's what happened with Boston, right?
Right.
Like they showed how dominant of a team they were in the finals
Mm-hmm.
by winning in like 5 games, right? If
Yep.
that goes 7, still you give them a ton of credit, but obviously you're thinking like with such a huge discrepancy, like it may not be as competitive as we think, and that's kind of what's happened the last few finals, right? Where it's like you're going in and you're like, oh, this might be a really good series, and it's like, no, it wasn't as great as we thought. But
Not
I
at all.
think this will still be fun. I could see it being like OKC wins decisively, but maybe a lot of the games are kind of close and competitive. It could be that, right? Like because we've seen 5 game series where it's like, oh, each game was like back and forth until the end, something like that. But I don't know. I like I said, I'd be shocked if OKC lost, but
Yeah, me too.
who knows? I guess I was shocked that they went to 7 against Denver.
True.
So maybe Indiana can find some things that Denver did, like we talked about with the zone defense and some other things where they may be able to kind of pull off a couple of upsets. But 4 against Oklahoma City, I don't think any team can answer for that,
Exactly.
especially not this season. And that's
Exactly.
the tough part.
Yep.
But like I said, regardless of what happens, the Pacers deserve a ton of credit for making this run, right? In a way where everybody's talked about it, right? Like going back to having the other previous franchise guys like Reggie Miller, they went to the finals in 2000.
Yep.
They had Paul George once upon a time. They made some deep runs. Then everybody's been talking about like how both teams benefited from
Yeah,
trading Paul
I saw
George,
that.
right?
Yeah.
Because he goes to Oklahoma City and it's Oladipo and Sabonis coming back. Then eventually they trade Sabonis for Halliburton, right? And at the time it looked like a win-win. Now it looks like it's just more win for Indiana.
Oh yeah,
But
big time.
that's why you always kind of wait it out and see what it looks like. But at least Sacramento made the playoffs
Yep.
um, a couple years ago. But either way, yeah, just a great story for the Pacers. Um, and it's funny, right? Because again, last year, remember Halliburton kind of arrived when we watched the in-season tournament, right? Because that was kind of where he made a name for himself, where everybody was talking about him, and it's like, look at this guy, look at this team. You know, where do they go from here? We picked against them, I think, every time, and then they ended up going to the conference finals. And then obviously, like you said, a lot of people thought it was a fluke. I think we picked under, and I don't think we expected them to get back to the conference final. So maybe we were kind of in that tier. But they've shown all year, especially this latter part and the postseason, that like no, it's not a fluke. They're a really good team in the Eastern Conference, one of the best, and they're going to be around for probably a while because they got a good amount of flexibility here. And then obviously OKC's path, we know about them, where what was it 13 years ago they were in the finals with that previous core, right? Durant, Westbrook, Harden. And it's funny how windows can change because we thought that team was going to be back and have multiple finals runs, maybe a championship or two in there. Never went back to the finals again, right? The last year, right? Because then Harden's traded. Then you had the last year with Russ and Durant where they're up 3-1 against Oklahoma, against Golden State. We know the rest that happens. And then obviously from there, then eventually, obviously, that's just the crazy part of that Clippers Oklahoma City trade, right? What do you think of that trade in the long run? Because I think at the time, it's like it's some of it's in hindsight, right? Because like at the time, it's like if you're the Clippers, you're trading to get Paul George, but also to get Kawhi, right? Like he maybe doesn't come to the Clippers if you don't pull that off. Maybe he goes somewhere else. Maybe he stays in Toronto. Maybe he goes to the Lakers. We don't know,
Right.
right? Maybe he would have been willing to give it a gap year. I don't know. But I think at the time, nothing really wrong with it. It's just rough because now you fast forward 6 years later, and OKC definitely won the trade because now they're in the finals while the Clippers only went to the conference finals one time in that, era. Paul George is gone. Obviously, the Clippers had a really good regular season this year, but it doesn't feel like they're on the upswing. But OKC's in the upswing, and they may be able to pull off this championship, and probably will, I think,
Yeah.
This year. And obviously, you also got back SGA, who people didn't know what he was going to be, but people liked him. And now he's blossomed into a superstar. Then you also nailed the picks around that, right? Because then you got Chet and Jalen Williams in the same draft. Then you were able to take flyers on other guys like Lou Dort, um, Aaron Wiggins, right? Cason Wallace. And then obviously the big offseason additions, Hartenstein and Caruso, right? Where Giddy's out, Caruso's in, and then you traded for Hayward last year. Doesn't work out, but you get Hartenstein. So they've kind of just done everything. Very few misses, right? Because like the Hayward trade in the moment didn't work out, but you cleared cap space to get Hartenstein. A couple other draft picks didn't really work out. What was it like? Darius Baisley. What was that other guy's name? Pokashevsky. That other guy, right? Like some picks that didn't work out, but you're gonna have those every once in a while, right? But now you're in this great spot where you're in the finals, probably going to win it. And then even going into future seasons, right? Like you're not going to be paying a ton next season because their young guys are still going to be under their rookie contracts. And, you're just doing great. So, shout out to them as well, right? Both teams, right? Both small market teams that were able to figure out different ways. Because even like Indiana never went through a rebuild, right? They just kind of traded some guys here and there, and then eventually landed on Halliburton. Then, of course, made the push for Siakam. That obviously helped put them over the top as well. And it's funny because last year, right, we loved the Siakam deal and thought it got the Pacers closer to the top of the East, right? Just not quite like finals level, but we were like, this is a great move for the Pacers, and it sets them up for next season because we talked about in the offseason the ability for them to have a full year with these guys, figure out everything, and now the fruits of all that are taking place where now, like I said, they're here, 4 more wins, but I don't think they're going to be able to pull it off. But either way, regardless, if you're the Pacers, you should be super pumped about this moment,
Yeah.
as should Oklahoma City.
Yeah, like you said about the Paul George thing, it is kind of funny how people do kind of circle back to that. And I feel like if you're the Clippers, right, and like you said, and you don't know what is going on in today's climate, right? I think you have to do that trade 10 times out of 10, right? Because you look at it, and it's like Paul George is third in MVP voting that year. It was the best
Right.
version of him. Apparently, the story goes, Kawhi didn't want to come to LA unless PG, was there with him, right? And I think who wouldn't want, to both of those guys, at the time being so elite, together. And, during the regular season that year, they were fine. But, also, like you said, everybody liked SGA. They knew he was going to be a good player. They didn't know he was going to be great, right? But, it is what.
OKC didn't know that.
Exactly. It is what it is. And, mentorship and team structure, goes a long way for that. Shout out to Sam Presti. Shout out to Oklahoma City for even, being able to concoct, that whole, roster they have. And like you said, with Indiana as well, like a lot of, no, they don't have any blue chip prospects, right?
Right.
Indiana has no, like top 3 picks, top 5 guys, right? They're all like, what, outs, like lower lottery guys, right? Or,
I think
or
Ashford
below,
was the highest pick. I think
which
maybe
is
he was like
wild.
6.
Yeah, which is
Yeah.
wild. So it's like, considering that they never really got that kind of talent, that kind of just shows you, you know, they really did trust the real process, right? And they went out and got guys that they really liked, and they were able to carefully craft a good system, right? And that's the cool part about it. So, like you said, I think it's awesome when you do have small market finals like this.
Right. Yeah. So we'll see where this goes. But like I said, I expect Oklahoma City to win, as do you, and they get that title. And, we'll see where it goes from here. But it should be a fun matchup. And obviously, we'll be talking about it as it goes on, because, again, this is the finals. And, we're almost here at the end of the NBA season. Just kind
Yep.
of funny. And obviously, once the season ends, we'll have some time to reflect and kind of look at, over the course of this season and, everything else. So
Yes.
that I think is going to be fun. So now let's get into some news and rumors to probably close it out. Of course, um, one thing that Brian Windhorst said is that the Raptors are eyeing a big fish trade. They're one of the teams looking to make moves in the offseason. So he mentioned the Raptors are a team that is starting to make noise within the league about looking for a big fish. There are some teams that sniff the ability to make a move, and I think Toronto is one of those teams. Obviously, they do have a number of guys that they could, I guess, tout and kind of showcase for other teams. They got some young guys, right? Like, I don't think Barnes is going anywhere because they drafted him and paid him. But, like, you got Quickly, you got RJ Barrett, you got Grady Dick. They just got Brandon Ingram. So I could see them doing something. I don't know what it would be. Like, I know they, maybe some people have suggested Giannis. I don't know what the core would be once you do that. Like, and if you get that core, what does it look like? I don't know, but I don't know. I feel like the Raptors, they're kind of always in this, and then they haven't done as much in recent years. Although they got Ingram, but they didn't have to really give up much to get him. So, like, if you're getting a big fish, right? Who are you giving up? Who are you willing to give up? And that's where I'm kind of curious to see where this goes.
Yeah, I mean, they have a ton of picks, right? They also have, a ton of young talent, right? That would, I think, be pretty good, right? And in different situations, probably contribute a lot more in a super winning situation. But I have no problem with that. I think they should be a team that I think really watch around the deadline, probably. But we'll see.
Right. Then, according to Mark Stein, Miles Turner and Nas Reed are reportedly eyed by the Pistons. So, sounds like the Pistons want to stretch big. Turner, I mean, I would think he'd be re signed by Indiana, right? Reed's the one that's a little bit different because he's got the player option where he'll probably opt out and be a free agent. We know Minnesota probably can't bring back all of their guys, but if Reed goes to a team like Detroit, right, you would think it'd be like some type of sign and trade or something, but I don't know. I mean, I know he kind of mentioned in his exit interview that like maybe he kind of sees himself as a starter, so maybe that's another topic of discussion because he's probably the backup as long as Gobert's there,
Yep.
and Randall are there. So, what do you think? Do you think that there's an actual chance that he could leave Minnesota and go to Detroit or somewhere else?
I think so. As beloved as he is, by the fans, I think there is definitely, an opportunity there for him to, showcase what he's really got, right? Because we only see it, I think it's very limited at times because like you said, he's not a starter, right? So if he was a starter for a younger team, right, that fits kind of the timeline, I think he fits it 100%. So that would kind of be intriguing. He always has had, I guess, a little bit of a question mark defensively at times, but offensively, he's a huge spark plug, and I think he could do some really good things. I think in Detroit, but we'll see. I don't know if it's super likely, but I could see it happening though.
Yeah, and Mark Stein also just mentioned like that Giannis could hold up a Durant trade, like just based off of like they expect Durant to be moved, but that you probably need more clarity first from Giannis, right? Because that could determine like, all right, if Giannis asks out, the teams that have a chance to get him will try to get him first. Then maybe if Giannis is like, no, I'm gonna stay, right? Then they'll some teams maybe will pivot to Durant, or after Giannis gets traded, then the ones who don't get Giannis may pivot to Durant. So we'll see. I mean, obviously, I guess at this point you'd rather have Giannis just because he's closer to being still in his prime. But either way, like everybody's been talking about, this should be a busy offseason regardless. But can't say a whole lot yet just because the finals are about to start.
Sure thing.
Nikhil Alexander Walker linked to Orlando, according to Mark Stein. So that's another thing that we talked about, like the same with Nas Reed, where the Wolves may not be able to keep all of those guys. So is there a scenario where maybe one of those teams overpays to be able to bring in one of those guys? And if they do, maybe they're gone. Because obviously, if Minnesota overpays, then that puts them deeper into that tax, makes it harder to do some things when they're probably not quite at the level of being comfortable with being in the second apron.
Yeah, I mean, I could see that happening. I think he fits kind of what they would want, right? I mean, he's not like a complete knockdown shooter, right? There is a level of streakiness to it, but defensively, he's a dog, right? And I think that's the thing that they're known for. So it would be interesting if they did like triple down on that. That would be kind of cool.
Right. Exactly. And then, just a couple of pieces from that athletic that I had already mentioned. Multiple players only meetings. Tibbs still has the support of Brunson and Leon Rose as well. So James Dolan's going to have the final say. And then players and coaches were also annoyed with Towns' defensive habits throughout the season, which, like I said, we talked about earlier, where it's like, yeah, it's never a good sign that this stuff comes out after you lose a playoff series, but it also shows that they got some work to do in order to move forward to whatever the ceiling of this team is, if they haven't already hit that ceiling, because this
Yeah.
could be the ceiling.
Yeah, and none of the stuff that, came out really surprised me in all honesty, right? We even saw last year in the postseason, Anthony Edwards literally telling Karl Anthony Towns, stop fouling in a post game presser. I know there were some jokes about it, but there's a little bit of truth behind every joke. So, I would understand that, right? Because, the foul trouble, the lack of defensive intensities, it does definitely, put you in a position where, yeah, you're going to get targeted and teams are going to punish you for that. And there's literally nothing you can do, especially when it's pretty much on one individual. But, regardless, I think the Knicks are in a good situation going forward. It's not like, this is the be all end all for them.
Right. And, that pretty much concludes today's episode of Off Ball Takes. Again, let us know your thoughts on this finals. What is your pick to win this series? Who do you expect to pop off, that isn't amongst the stars? Should be a really good series. Of course, if you always want, we do polls on IG. So go to at the OBT podcast if you want to join that. Of course, we also post on the other socials, X, TikTok, and YouTube as well. Just the last final shout out, just an older comment from the offseason. This was from Billy Osborne, DY9EI. And he said last year the Pacers played up to the competition. They would win the games against contenders, but play down to the worst teams. This year that shouldn't happen. They are a really close team, and now they have Pascal to kind of act as the guy who can just go get them a bucket. But they got to have a better scheme defensively. I say they're at 49-33, given health. Good job, guys. I'll be listening again. He was basically right on the money, right?
Yeah.
Because they ended up, in terms of their record, I mean, they were what, like, I think they got what, 50 wins, so they were 50-32. So he was right there, and I just wanted to shout him out because he said this on our Pacers offseason video, right? So this was back like 8-9 months ago, right? So because this was like during the summer, so just wanted to shout him out, and
Yeah.
obviously there's kind words, really good comment, and hey, you were right on this team.
Yeah, big time. Like you said, he hit it right on the head. Like that's pretty wild, spot on. And yeah, everybody, I think, including us, did like the Pacers and what they were able to do. But it was just a matter of them, getting here and come playoff time. And yeah, they've done it. So awesome.
Yes. And like I said, if you want to join in and leave a comment on the video that we'll read at the end, of course, you can always do that. And continue to support the channel by liking and subscribing, helping our channel grow, getting past our previous goal of 200 subs. Let's get to 500. So hopefully you can help us out. Appreciate all that. We'll see you next episode.